Very much for coming along to the session today. Hope you're having a good conference so far. Hope you enjoyed lunch. So the session today, just set some expectations, is the Swiss cheese security pattern. It's a talk that's focused about helping you understand the right mindset for security, how to approach it. We're not going to dive into demos, there's not going to be code, anything like that. It's really a sort of, this is the way to look at it, this is the way to understand it, and we'll go from there. So, who is this person at the front? My name's John. My pronouns are he, him. Been working with the Microsoft data platform and data platforms in general for, gotta be nearly 20 years now. Getting long in the tooth. Contact details are there. I'm a senior data engineering consultant at Advancing Analytics. So if you want to, reach out to me on email, connect with me on LinkedIn. My GitHub's there as well. So feel free. So what we're going to cover today. Going to start thinking about how to build a security strategy, because this is where it kind of goes wrong in my experience. A lot of people we've got strategies, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, this is what we want to achieve, and it kind of gets a bit muddled. What you really want to do is how to say, okay, we want to set this up and be really clear. So we're going to talk about that. We'll talk about the mindset for security as well, because if you don't think about security in the right way, you're going to end up with an inherently less secure platform, which means your risk's going to be much, much higher. We'll start talking about some of the first principles for securing systems as well and how to think about it. And then we'll look at, you should be familiar with have a show of hands, who here is familiar with the onion analogy for security, about the layers? Yeah. Okay. Who here thinks it's good? There's a few. No one, this is good. So fingers crossed, we're in the right place. But I'm going to contrast it with what I term the Swiss cheese analogy and explain why when we get there, okay? So, the first thing is to come up with a strategy, not strategies, okay? We've got a cloud strategy, it's cloud security strategy. Put my teeth back in. We've got an on-premises strategy. This is what we're going to do for this application. That's our strategy. Fundamentally, you want a security strategy that is a guiding set of principles for how you're going to approach securing your IT infrastructure. And you build it from there, okay? If you are thinking about, oh, we're going to do 3 or 4 different ways, you start sending muddled messages out to the teams who are implementing it. And that's where you start to get the disconnects between teams, and that's where you end up with problems, okay? If everybody's on the same page and working towards the same goal, the way they go about implementing it, so long as it adheres to the strategic direction, that's what you really want to be looking for, okay? Now, when we start thinking about it, the implementation piece is where you get into your operational policies, your process, your procedures, okay? They're more tactical in nature, okay? They're more focused about potentially discrete technologies or parts of your technology stack, okay? So when it comes to building a strategy, I like to try and keep it a bit more general, a bit more expansive, and then work in from there. So this comes into the first step for the mindset, okay? Now there's 2 contrasting approaches in my experience, okay? We've got security first or secure by design. Now, when I say security first, what I mean here is that the security team is the driving force behind how it's going to work, okay? You are going to do this, you're going to do, they're very prescriptive typically, okay? Security is the first consideration when you start doing your solution architectures, your high-level designs, your low-level designs, your implementation, okay? In my experience, that approach leads to an inherently less secure environment, okay? The reason that I say that is because it doesn't take into account usability, by and large. Security is your focus, that is your first concern. Well, I don't care if it impacts usability. That's counterintuitive because people are inherently lazy. I'm a person, I don't want to do more work and more effort than I have to in order to get my job done between the hours of 9 and 6 when I'm being paid, okay? If I am being less productive because I am running into security walls every day, I'm going to get frustrated, and I'm going to actively try to circumvent them, not because I've got malicious intent, because I want an easy life, you know? I go to work to get money to go and have fun outside, you know? I ride motorbikes in my spare time. I go to work to put money in my bank account so I can put fuel in my fuel tank and go wandering around the roads in North Scotland. Fun. Things that get in the way of that, I'm going to try and get around them. So I want an easier life. I don't want to be doing lots and lots of repetitive tasks and circumvent and having to take it from here, put it there, and authorize this, and what have you, okay? So security first is very much very prescriptive. This is how we're going to build it. These are the security constraints. This is what you're going to do. These are the technologies you're going to use. I contrast this with secure by design. The term secure by design, in my view, is you're taking into account a more holistic approach and saying, what are the user requirements, okay? What are the outcomes? What are we trying to achieve, okay? And then work back from that and say, okay, well, how do we do that in a way that minimizes risk, okay? Now, this is the fun bit, is a lot of the times, and I was guilty of this early in my career, I was the DBA, and I'm responsible, this is my security. I'm saying this, I'm saying that. And that's not right, okay? Fundamentally, the security and the risks are owned by the business. They should be. If you're in an organization that pushes that down onto the person, that's a questionable approach and a questionable business approach, in my view. The business is the one, because technically, really, they're the ones that are going to be paying for the technology and the approaches and the people and everything like that that goes along with it. They're the ones that need to be coming in and saying, okay, what are the risks? And as technologists, we'll be saying, okay, well, we've got this risk, this risk, this risk, and this risk. And then the business is going to say, well, I'm willing to accept this, this, and this. I don't like that, make that go away. Now, if the business is saying, yeah, I want you to just stick everyone in there, it's not great. But if the business is willing to accept that risk, that's the business owners. Log that information, because especially if you're working in a compliance environment, logging is key. But it comes down to establishing the requirements, doing the design, identifying the risks, and then moving forward from there. And if the business is willing to accept a risk, you log that risk on a risk log. This is it. There we are. It's that category, that much risk. And then you go forward from there. So, and by doing that and taking into account the usability aspect of things and the desired outcomes, you look to try and achieve a balance. And that's the important thing, okay? It's everyone here familiar with performance tuning of a technology you're familiar with. You can tune one part of it and you just move the bottleneck from point A to point B to point C, okay? And it's much the same with security. If you secure point A really, really well and really heavily, then that's going to impact the ability for, there's your bottleneck. You get past that and it's nice and easy to do. But also you start thinking about that depth as well and the overall systems approach and how those components interact. By taking that sort of design approach, it will give you a more secure system because you've put thought into it. You're looking at risks rather than being prescriptive about this is what we do because that's what I've said. Okay. When you understand those risks and then you look at how they evolve over time, you review them, you end up in a better position. So for a very high level sort of scenario strategy, you would say something along the lines of we'll secure our business assets using approved technologies. So again, you've got potentially a team that is approving security technologies and approaches, and those will change over time. If you bake that security stuff into your strategy, it means every time you change your technology, you're going to have to change your strategy document. Okay? You say it's something like approved technologies. So that's a piece that's going to flux. Okay? Compliance obligations. In this case, GDPR, PCI-DS, Cyber Essentials, these are compliance regimes that the business may have accepted. They're less likely to change as frequently as your technology, in my experience. But you could say under the obligations specified in whatever. So you can sort of start referencing other things, okay? And the approach will balance risk appetite of the business. You come back to say, okay, it's the business that's going to be you're going to be identifying the risk, but it's the business is going to be making the decision around what its appetite for risk is. And that will change over time. It will change from business to business. So again, it's not one size fits all, okay? But also there you're saying the usability requirements of the systems involved. Because if you make it easy for people to use and you understand the risks, you're going to have people not trying to circumvent it as much, and the risk that comes with someone doing something like that. So the number of times I've seen policies in place where no removable media, nothing on your laptops, things like that, get them circumvented, laptop lost, reportable requirement under some compliance regulations, world of pain. Just because, well, I need to work on this offline. And you're giving them a laptop. Okay, well, what's the risk? Okay, well, we can mitigate some of those risks. We'll talk about some of those a little bit later. But there are ways of understanding that's a risk. How do we potentially look at mitigating it or reduce the potential risk impact? There are options, always options, okay? So once you've come up with the strategy piece, what we start thinking about is, okay, well, what is our strategy window? And by this, I mean, how often are we going to be reviewing it? It's not just a set and forget. It's something as the business changes over time, as the threat sort of evolves over time, as the technologies evolve over time, you want to go back and review that. And typically you want to say, okay, we'll review it annually. Okay, we'll review it, and then off the back of that, we may make changes, and then that will cascade down. There may be some impetus, if maybe off the back of an event, perhaps. So if you do have a security breach or a compromise of some form, you'll go back and say, okay, well, where was our strategy deficient? Was our strategy deficient? Or was it our implementation that might have been deficient? Okay, so you think about those drivers. If you haven't had an event, okay, every year we're going to go and review it, and you have a process defined for that, so it's nice and easy to do. Okay, how are you going to measure the effectiveness of the strategy? Okay, what are your KPIs or whatever to say, yeah, we're aligned with whatever. So, for example, we're going to use the approved AV solution, so antivirus solution. In that scenario, you'll come in and say, okay, well, that's deployed on N percentage of all of our estate. Should ideally be 100%. Updates should be going out and having an age no greater than 2 days for out of date. So those are things you can potentially measure. Those things are measurable, okay? Number of breaches, number of, and when I say breach, don't just mean an external breach. You can have inadvertent data exposure. So someone changes roles, but they don't get moved out of the security role that they're in and have access to customer data when they shouldn't. That's still something that you want to log as an event, okay? It's not something you just sort of, oh, well, we'll deal with that. Keep a log of it, because in the event of something happening, having this paper trail, this audit trail, will help if you have an external auditor or compliance person come in and say, okay, we're going to help you respond to this. Or if you're going to have a third party that you have on retainer to come in and you're going to give them the information and say, right, help us get out of this situation, okay? Maintain that audit history, but if you've got that measure, it makes life a lot easier. It also means that when you come back to review how well's our strategy doing, you've got a benchmark there as well. You can say, so give you some idea, things like the security score in Azure, for example, which is a bit of a red herring number. It's just sort of an arbitrary, it goes up or down, and it's a bit Microsoft say this and what have you, but it's about picking what's appropriate to you. But you find that level, and then if there's a deviation from it, that's what you're looking for. If it gets better, great. What have we done? Can we do more of it? If it gets worse, what have we done? Can we do less of it? Something like that, okay? Like I say, review schedule, make sure it's working appropriately. Now, how many people here do risk assessments of their environment, include that in their design documents, the solution architectures, anything like that? Some of you. I would encourage you to, once you've done the design, go back and look at the scenario and say, okay, well, what do we need to adhere to? That's going to be a driving factor, is that we need to be within the sort of Data Protection Act, GDPR, or PCI DSS. Those are compliance regulations that we should be adhering to. Go back and say, okay, well, what are the risks associated with potential gaps here? Okay, because that's going to drive compensating controls that you may need to write and put in place. But at the same time, document any assumptions you make, because those are also risks. Because if you're saying, I am assuming this, this, and this, if those assumptions are incorrect, then you've potentially got a problem. Document your assumptions and give them a risk category. okay? Little things like that, bring it all together. And the most important thing to understand when we start thinking about the state of mind, it's going to be a case of when, not if. You just look at the rate of breaches. I mean, I've been very lucky that I've never worked anywhere, knowingly, has had a large external breach. I've been in situations where we've had inadvertent exposure of sensitive data internally, and that's been dealt with accordingly using the processes. Much easier to handle. But again, you start thinking about when, not if. The reason being is, when it happens, it's not a surprise, okay? You're going in there and you say, I'm going to plan for the worst, I'm going to expect the best, but I'm going to have a plan for when something does happen. So you don't run around with your hair on fire, waving your arms around going, what do we do? And by that, I mean, it's also a case of, okay, we know we've got a high risk profile because we're running publicly facing financial systems or whatever. Okay, well, we know what we want to do for a technology perspective. We accept there's a risk that something's going to probably happen because you may be working in a industry sector that is prone to attack, so or particularly vulnerable if it's sort of critical national infrastructure, things like that, power grids, those sort of where you've got a lot of legacy technical debt. Increased risk profile, something may happen, how do we handle it? That also then drives the situation of, okay, well, let's engage some specialists on a retainer. In the event that something happens, we can bring in a knowledgeable third party who deals with it on a regular basis, and they can guide us. Things like that. You think about, okay, how can we mitigate these risks? Okay. And by taking that approach, we bake the security in. It's not an afterthought. I've worked at several organizations through my career where it's like, look, just get it done and ship it. Okay, we'll worry about a security thing after the case. Or don't worry about it, we'll just stick it behind a WAF, a web application firewall. That'd be fine. You've got cross-site scripting built. You will stick it behind a WAF, it'll be fine. The marketing material says it'll protect it. Okay, just sign that off in the decision log, please. You know, you put it in the risk spreadsheet, in the risk log. We'll go back and reevaluate it. We'll go and get a third party to come in and do a pen test once it's behind there. We'll do it behind, in front of the WAF as well and say, what's our risk situation? What do they recommend? But if you want to ship something in expedited way, it's happened. I've been there and it's like, I raise the concerns, JFDI. Not great, but it's not my head, really. It's a case of you've made the decision, you're the business, you're willing to accept this, fine. Stick it in an email. I'm going to keep that email. I very rarely delete anything. I've got that, so if something does happen, I've got the evidence trail so you can satisfy the auditors. I mean, the key thing there, I mean, coming from an auditing perspective as well, is if you are involved in a breach, something like GDPR, you've got exposure of PII, one of the things they're going to look for is, do you know the scope? Can you quantify it? Okay? When you start thinking about that and baking that in, and that's what you're going to look at from a security mindset perspective, okay, well, we know that it was only 10% of our PII store that was potentially exposed, versus we haven't got a clue, so we've got to assume everything. Well, that's going to sort of show you a little bit negligent, therefore you're potentially going to get larger fines. And then, like I say, if you've got that and we quantify it, we know this is what we've got, this is what we're expecting, that's our potential blast radius, and then you collaborate with the auditor or the governance organization, you stand a better chance of coming out of it the other side without punitive damages. And I keep coming back and saying systems approach. It's not just points of isolation, okay? You've got the database, and within the database you've got any number of things that you can use to secure data. You've got views, procedures, functions. Erlen sat here. If you've got stuff around that, go and read his blog. He's got some great material on there about securing stuff within the database. Then you start stepping out of the database, you're the instance level, okay? Then you step out of that, you've got the OS level, or if you're on PaaS, okay, now we're into the Azure infrastructure level. How are we going to do with networking? How are we going to deal with all of the other bits and pieces that sit around that? Simply isolating and securing one small component potentially leaves you exposed in other areas. So you start thinking about backups being a big one there as well. Where are they? How often are they kept? Do you need to get rid of them over a period of time? Okay, where are they stored? The number of times that, yeah, that's fine, they'll just stick them on the tape and we'll stick it in someone's car and they'll drive it down Iron Mountain or something like that. and you're dealing with this under PCI DSS environment, well, really, you probably would get Iron Mountain to come and collect it, in all honesty, rather than sticking it in someone's car, and if they stop at the supermarket and the bag goes missing, you've got a problem. Okay, they may have been encrypted, but okay. But it's all about balance. And like I say, if you do it all too much in one place, you can forget about others, or you make it difficult to use. Not great. Think about that balance over everything. You want to tune the overall system. That's the important thing. When we start thinking about the systems approach, fundamentally, technology on its own is utterly useless. As a technologist, I'm quite happy to say that. Because the way that I look at it is, okay, I take technology. I'm going to use this technology in conjunction with a process. Okay? And then the interaction between people, process, and technology, bringing all that together, that's how we solve problems. That's how we add business value. But this is also where the threats exist. Because in order for us to secure a system, we've still got to have it usable, which means we've got to open it up. Okay? Just having a little box of data sat in the corner doesn't really help our business. And this is where we start thinking about the onion analogy. Okay? The reason I really don't like this is because it's those solid layers and those rings around a central core that we're looking to protect. Can give a sort of false sense of security. You hear about, oh, we're really secure, we've got this, we've got this, we've got this, we've got this. And you've got your web application firewalls, you've got your network firewalls, we're using IPsec, we're using TLS, we're using storage encryption, we're using TDE, we're using always encrypted. Well, that's nice. Okay. How usable is it? But you've got all of those things, and they're all protecting data. But you're still letting people in there. You're still getting data in, and you're still getting data out. Okay? Those layers have got holes in them. And they're holes that are, by and large, by design, because how else am I going to make the system usable? There will be holes in that system simply because there are vulnerabilities in things. It's humans writing code, by and large, even with Copilot. And that's a whole other session on its own about potential issues from a security perspective. But it's all about saying, okay, we've got these security layers, but I'm putting holes in them. Some of them I know about, some of them I may not know about. Okay? The ones you create yourself versus the ones that may exist already, but you're willing to accept that risk. Okay? That's the important thing. And it's just arranged, so you're sort of minimizing that sort of pathway through. So you take one piece of Swiss, you pop it down, you've got some holes, and I still see the bread. I'm like, I'm not happy with this sort of risk exposure of whatever it is I'm protecting. I'll put another slice on, and you end up with a nice cheesy sandwich. It's good. But you need to understand about, okay, well, at every layer within our architecture, within our solution, we're going to be opening things up. Okay? So, before we go any further, has anyone got any questions? Anyone got any thoughts? No? Is there anything from the people online? Nothing there? Okay. Right then, so the next part of this, we'll start thinking about the things that we have to do when we are creating these holes within our security layers. Okay? And at the most fundamental level is access. Physical access. Okay? And this was always an interesting one when I first started working with cloud technologies, which has got to be nearly a decade ago now. Which, again, old. You get people saying, well, how do I know that it's physically secure? Okay. Not even Satya can get into a Microsoft data center very easily. Okay, for Azure. Very difficult things to get into. Physical security there, very, very tough. The same with many colos. Although, there are some interesting ones. There was an article in the Register a couple of years ago where someone went to the planning office, downloaded the designs of the data center, and noticed a small flaw in the physical infrastructure. In the gents' toilets, you had the wall of urinals. And there's a couple of different ways you can build these toilet areas, one of which was they had a door at this end and a door at that end. But the toilet block was spanning the secure wall. So essentially, they could go to the toilets in the public area, behind the urinals, hop over into the secure area bathroom, and open the door at the other end, circumventing the little rotating thing to get in and all the security that goes with it. It's little things like that, which you're not necessarily going to look at, and that's what the threat actors will do. But physical access comes back to it again. I worked at an organization, we've got our very secure doors, we've got a very secure room that's our computer stuff's in, we've got locks on the cabinets, but the keys are still in them, and it's just standard plasterboard walls around some big, heavy fire doors. Well, I can go through that wall without even thinking about it. Or you've got the raised, or sort of the ceiling tiles where you've got the space above, and it's just a partition wall up to the tiles, and you can go over the top, things like that. The physical infrastructure is something you need to think about. What's the risk exposure? Okay, so that's something we need to think about. Okay, but you're still going to have physical access potentially if you're running your own environments. How do you rack and stack the servers? Who's got access? How do you gain that? Or do you offload that to someone like Microsoft, AWS, Google, whoever, where they've got a lot of compliance and regulations in place or processes. They're audited by external auditors all the time, and you get an attestation saying, yeah, they've actually got some pretty solid process and procedure in place to minimize who has physical access. And obviously with some of the big cloud vendors, it's a hugely, massively distributed thing. So you're not easily going to go in and pull a disk for a database because it's spread out over everything. Versus I've got my 2U rack mount server with a few disks in it, and someone can take them out and put them in a small holdall and be gone. It's little things like that. Then we have our network access. This is always a fun one. If you've got databases or data platform scenarios, you're going to have them network connected in one form or another because applications need to speak to them. Whether it's reporting tools, ETL tools, the actual application front end or web services, things like that. And again, we start thinking about how are we going to grant that network pathway through. Okay, now, I've worked at a couple of organizations where very heavily segmented, physical firewalls, okay? Hundreds of firewall rules, nearly thousands, okay? I went to do some security auditing, and / core SQL Server database name, / I can see shares from my laptop. Enter. Oh yeah, I can see database backup files. I can navigate, there's database data files. There's various other bits and pieces that are on there. So I ping that pathway over to one of the security guys and I'm like, can you just go here and have a look? He's like, oh, I can see that. You just try and create a text file for me in there, would you? Oh yeah, he can. I could see it. Now, that scenario, it was a core database server that had a huge amount of very sensitive information for financial information. My laptop, I was sat at home, connected on the VPN. Okay. Now you start thinking about how firewalls work from a network perspective. I'm opening up, I've got the potential to say, okay, I want things with this IP address to be allowed through. Now, in many cases, end user compute network segments, so your laptops, your PCs, things like that, dynamically allocated IP addresses. So it's much more difficult to say, I want to let this PC in to this secure area. So in a lot of those scenarios, yeah, just let that whole IP range through. So what I discovered was that every laptop in the business, whether they were connected to the physical infrastructure in an office or on a VPN, had the ability to just go to SMB access to that database server. That's not a good scenario, okay? That's the thing to say, okay, well, if people do need physical, or do need that desktop level access or SMB access or whatever, well, we want that to be a controlled number of people. So when we go back to doing our design, okay, I probably want to put maybe some virtualized desktop in there so that I can go to something that's secure, it's restricted, or I want to look at investing heavily in some networking management software that allows things through, or there's various options that you can take rather than just saying, screw it, we'll just stick that VPN, that network segment, and we'll leave it wide open, which is not great, okay? And again, when you start going into that, even if you've got that secure and you've limited what can go into those network segments, how many people here are still running infrastructure on premises or in colos or whatever? IaaS, VMs, things like that. Okay, a lot of you doing PaaS and stuff like that, I guess. Or okay, so those you doing PaaS, there's some networking things there for using public networks or versus the private networking. But for those of you on premises still using things like Windows OS or Linux OS, how many have got the firewalls turned on each of those OSs? Okay. How many people here are familiar with the concept of lateral movement? One. Okay. So essentially what lateral movement is, I get into the network segment. So I've typically got, if I'm crossing from one IP address boundary into another, I'm going through a firewall, by and large, or a router. And I've got that element control where I can say, I've got a ACL. Once I'm within that network segment, I'm essentially able to broadcast to other things within that network segment, which means I can then jump sideways from one machine to another until I find one that can get out. Okay? So if you're doing that, you want to start thinking about, okay, we're layering it. We really want to put a little bubble around the individual machine or the collection of machines that we're working with. So in the case of an availability group, for example, I want to set it up so that those machines can communicate with one another on a specific port set. But nothing else should be, I shouldn't be allowed to go from one server to another server on standard sort of TDS port to be able to run queries, unless there's a very specific reason to incorporate that in the design. So that's what we need to start thinking about from a network access perspective, or an access perspective. We've got physical access, we've got network access. And then we've got to really break that down and say, well, what's permitted? What's our risk exposure? And it comes down to cost-benefit analysis. Do we expect people, is the business willing to sort of say, well, you know, I'm less fussed about lateral movement because A, B, and C. Okay? Log that in the risk log, off we go. Review it on a regular basis. Okay? So again, when we start thinking about those different layers that are available to us, we start with the most fundamental one, is granting levels of access. Authentication. This is always a fun one. Are you going to use, what's your identity provider? Entra ID. Microsoft keep changing the damn name of it. AAD, Active Directory, whatever it's called this particular week. Okta, IAM with AWS, GCP, whatever those options are. Who is going to, what's your authentication provider? And are you going to offload that? I mean, in the traditional days of being on premises, we had a great scenario where my Active Directory was there, it was pretty much well bounded, that was my authentication provider. I'm saying who I am, I'm getting the token back to say, yep, middle certificate, I am who I say I am, off we go. Okta, third-party provider, allows you to do that with integration to applications, so on and so forth. They had a breach. That breach then exponentially exposes a lot of their customers who are using them as an authentication provider. So again, you've got to start thinking, well, are we going to offload that? What's our potential risk exposure? We're a small fish within a larger pool, things like that, okay? Are you going to use application or service-based ID management? So within the context of the application itself. SQL authentication, for example, in the case of SQL Server, or if you've got an application that's got it built into itself, it's got its own authentication provider, so you'll say username, password, whatever, and that's built and baked in. Think about how you're going to do that. Now, again, throughout my career, many years ago, SQL authentication was viewed as inherently insecure. It's not. SQL authentication is fundamentally secure. It's a great authentication mechanism. What was inherently insecure was the way that we just stick usernames and passwords in INI files, or XML files, or JSON files. That handling of the data, that was the bit that was inherently insecure. With the advent of good secret management tools, which are programmatically accessed now, so Key Vault, Secret Manager, Secret Server, for example, all of those sorts of things, HashiCorp Vault. We can store secret information like the username and password for SQL Auth in a secure way, programmatically get it, so we don't necessarily have to have it in a INI file or whatever. The best one I ever saw was the SA password and username straight in HTML in a web page. And it was like, really? Let's not do this. This is bad, please. And that was in a defense establishment, of all places. It's like, yeah, just because you're in an air-gapped environment doesn't mean that's the right way to do it, okay? And then you've got things like API keys, personal access tokens, and various other bits and pieces and options that are coming up. I'm focusing more around some of the stuff that you're dealing with a systems-based approach rather than sort of MFA and potentially for what you deal with as an end-user side of things. But you can think about the layers. But fundamentally, it's a case of, okay, well, what's my risk exposure by using each of these potential options? What mitigating factors, like a good secret manager, for example? Is everyone here using password managers? And personally, I use 1Password for pretty much everything. That gives me that element of security. Organizations should also be adopting those, and there's a multitude of them out there. Many organizations do, some don't. So again, just think about you're going to handle that scenario. If we're going to go for an application-based one, SQL authentication as the example, I'm going to put it in Key Vault, and I'm going to deal with that when I'm not going to hard code it into anything. I'm going to go and look it up, or you've got config manager or whatever. Okay, so there's various different options available to us. But again, think about that. Then we come down to authorization, which is different to authentication. Authentication is, hi, I'm me. Oh, yes, you are. Authorization is, I'm entitled to go and do that, look at this, pick that up, what have you, okay? Authorization is always a fun one. Are you going to grant permissions at a user level or a role level? So role-based security, RBAC. You go into the Azure portal, for example, you've got contributor, owner, secret manager, blob owner, things like that within the various different services. When you take that back to Azure Active Directory, you're dealing with AD groups potentially that you're putting users into, and then you're saying you've got read permission or write permission potentially on the files, or you link that to database roles. So you've got the logins that come in there to users, to database roles. What I can select this, I can create that, so on and so forth, okay? Now, who here's familiar with AWS IAM as a authentication? Okay, right. Do a quick contrast in a minute. Azure Active Directory, worked with it for my entire career. Wonderful thing. Users, groups, nest them in, nest the groups, off we go. Happy days, okay? But what that means is, if I'm working with users, if I assign authorization to that Azure Active Directory group and I pop a user in it, wherever they go, they've got those roles or those permissions all the time. So you've got to start really considering and thinking about aggregated permissions over a wide area. So this user is in this group, and this group, and this group, and this group. Okay, well, what's the aggregated permission set? Okay. Now, Microsoft have got products around PAM and PIM. This is the fun one. PAM is privileged access management. Essentially, you request access, you get it, that type of thing. PIM, I can't remember, my mind's just gone blank, but essentially it's a sort of just-in-time mechanism for I want to elevate my permissions to go and do something. Okay, that's a better way of doing it because then you've got to actively try and engage in something to have an authorization, say I want to do this job, which can implement a bit of a bottleneck. Contrast that with AWS's IAM platform where I can create a role, I can then assign authorization permissions to that role. So you can look in S3 buckets or access to RDS databases or bits and pieces within the portal, okay? As a user, I'm then granted permission to assume that role. So I only have those permissions for the duration that I've assumed the role and then surrendered it. So again, I don't carry that permission set with me everywhere I go with my user account. If I leave my laptop unlocked for whatever reason, I've got a little bit more protection in there. Yes? You can do that with Microsoft. Is that in the... Can you, yeah, sorry, I'm trying to understand. Can you use the microphone? Sorry, man. Is the microphone live, guys? Cool.
Yeah, you can do that in Microsoft now in like a package. So you ask for the role grant for like 6 hours, similar to PIM.
Yeah.
And then it gives you all the roles that you need to do your job.
Yes.
Basically.
So yeah, so it is akin to PIM like that, but it's from an IAM perspective, it's really baked in as a core principle to everything you do. So that's the sort of contrast there. So yeah, it is possible using the Microsoft with PIM and everything that goes with it. And as you say, the application configs and bits and pieces there. So, but what I'm saying is really just go and explore that. Don't just rely on, we'll stick it in groups because that's the way we've always done it. There's newer ways to do things.
No, I agree.
That's cool. Inheritance is the other thing as well. Just remember that one, where we've got grant permissions maybe at a schema level or high level, and if that cascades down. When we start implementing software, integration with authentication providers, we came back to mentioning Okta and AD and things like that. We want to start using software that integrates with them or can leverage that capability as well. Again, with the authorization, we want to look at software options that can integrate with it. Maintenance and vendor support is an interesting one. The use of unsupported software is a big no-no when you start looking at Cyber Essentials, PCI DSS. Sometimes it's a necessary evil. In which case, okay, we're going to build compensating controls. We're going to review it on a regular basis, try and gracefully exit that solution out of the business. It's not always the easiest thing to do. Again, I mean, SQL Server, Windows, they have end-of-life support, but you can then buy additional support for 3 years, but there's a prohibitive cost associated with it. And it only covers security vulnerabilities that are critical, if I remember correctly. So again, just think about how that's going to impact the way that you've got your software approvals and everything like that. So my biggest security worry in this day and age is encrypting malware, or encrypting destructive malware, which was spread within the environment. Just look at the likes of Maersk and the impact that has. I've worked with a couple of organizations where we've done destructive attack recovery projects. And that's why this is my biggest worry, is because it's absolutely flipping terrifying when you see the hugely permissive roles that people have from an aggregate permissions. You look at the overly permissive firewall rules that exist. It's all of that makes, especially in legacy environments. In newer environments, it's less of a concern for me. But in some of the legacy environments, where it's not been well documented and you're inheriting things, it's something that really does concern me, because trying to do that recovery process can mean you're doing it at massive scale. And are you geared up to it? That's what drives me when it comes to doing security stuff, and that secure by design approach, is this is one of the big things that sits there. I mean, there's, I think it's every December, Verizon do the breach report. It's a security, Verizon every year do a sort of summary document looking at all of the major threats that they collated with the FBI and things like that at the end of each year. So it's a good indicator of what's going on out there in the world. You're looking at malware, phishing, spear phishing. What are the most prevalent forms of approach that threat actors are taking? Well worth going and having a read. Definitely something you want to have a look at. So, has anyone had to do destructive attack recovery? You had encrypting malware or anything like that? Yeah, protect against it. That's cool. So yeah, I mean, luckily I haven't had to go and do that. I've known a lot of people that were involved in some recoveries, and it took a very long time and had a massive adverse impact on business. So big one this year. Sorry? No, so the statement was there was a very big one this year in the finance industry. I can't remember what that one was off the top of their head, but that's fine. Erlen.
Oh, we have a good start with Sweden as well.
Sorry.
Oh, speaking of...
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so in Sweden, they was a hosting provider that... So it was not just one customer that was attacked, but it spread to lots of customers. And some companies, well, they lost backup for 20 years.
Yeah.
And,
so yeah,
what happened there, I don't even want to know. And particularly, unless it was some kind of inside attack, it sounds like it was it was not a very good way set up.
So yeah, so as Erlen was saying, the impact, potential risk there, again, you're using an external provider for something. If they get breached, that's your systems. your customers as well. If that's your system, what's your level of exposure in the event of all your customers' data vanishing? Which is not a great scenario as well. So, with that, I've come to the end of my content. Have we got any more questions, statements, anything like that? Okay, well, in that case then, thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it. You'll get the feedback links for the conference and everything like that. Please fill them in. I think there's prizes associated with it. Charitable donations for all your feedback. The parties this evening, there are wristbands down at the front desk. If you want to go to the party, you need a wristband, so please go and grab that. Thank you very much. I hope you have a great rest of your conference.